morning. Welcome to the Point. This week in East Lansing, a group of legislators from the Agriculture Committee in the House and Senate had a joint hearing to talk about some of the problems facing farmers. It started out being a conversation about the wet spring and the lack of planting, but it went far beyond that to interest rates, all kinds of market concerns, even mental health issues. We talked to the director of Michigan's Agriculture Department, Gary McDowell, just after that meeting. As the director of the Department of Agriculture, maybe more important as a farmer, how concerning is the testimony you heard today?
Oh, it's very concerning. This testimony, you've heard those two farmers at the end talking about their future. They've been farming for years, probably all their life. And so much of this is third, fourth generation farmers, and they think they're going to be the generation that's going to lose the family farm. I've seen this over and over again. In Michigan, we're so unique with over 300 commodities, but every one of these commodities has a different story to tell you, and they're all are hurting. There's nothing out there right now that's working the way it should because of so many factors, the weather being the main one this year, but also the tariffs, changing in climate. I mean, I was up in Traverse City just Monday, and there's one young farmer there. He's in his 30s, him and his partner. He's in it for the long haul. His family's been there, and he right now is in studying Washington, one of our main competitors in the sweet cherry crops, and their maturity date has been moving up every 10 years, about a day or so. So he's planting varieties now that will come in after Washington. So that's what we got to do. We got to adapt. We do everything we can do to renovate it, but also to adapt to it. Whoever adapts to it will be in a stronger position.
The chairman of the House Agriculture Committee, Julie Alexander, talked to us about why she held the meeting, but we started with some of her background.
Well, it's definitely been an interesting path for me to travel. I grew up in Jackson County and went away to Western Michigan University to obtain my teaching degree, and then went back to Jackson County to start teaching, but a different part of the county, in a very rural part. And in my second year teaching, a friend introduced me to a local farmer. We went out on a date, we had dinner and movie, and then he said, "You want to go back to my place? I'll show you my cows." So that was our first date. Within 4 months we were engaged, and we've now been married 32 years. So I'll often say I became a farmer when I said I do at the altar.
And tell me about the kind of agriculture that you're involved in.
When I met my husband, we were milk producers. And as you know, that's definitely a challenging industry, being a dairy farmer. My husband and his father, and then our sons, milked cows for 40 years. We sold the milk herd a year and a half ago. My husband and I are blessed with 4 sons and a daughter. I'm sorry. My husband and I are blessed with 3 sons and a daughter, 4 children. And one of our sons is still in the farming operation with us. In addition to being former dairy farmers, we are grain producers. We grow about 1,500 acres of corn, soybeans, hay, and wheat.
I want to talk about the current condition of agriculture from 2 standpoints. One is your role, Chair of Ag, and the other as a producer. And a little later in this program, we're going to talk about a hearing that happened earlier in the week, as this will air on Sunday. It happened earlier in the week, and it brought together a lot of stakeholders, and it told an interesting story. But let's talk about your story for a minute. It was wet, and it was wet continuously during the spring. So if you're trying to get crops in the ground, you got a couple of choices. You cut ruts in the field and put it in the ground that's too wet and hope that it takes, or you don't plant, in which case you get delayed results at harvest, if any at all. So what has your experience been this year?
So for us specifically in the Jackson area, although it was a delayed planting season, we personally were able to get all of our crops in the ground. But that was rare for, we were by far in the minority there. One of the benefits of being married and being a farmer myself, my husband's talking to farmers all the time. So we have insight and input from all around the state. And when it comes to talking about the situation in Michigan, it's not consistent anywhere. It depends on the part of the state you live in. And it could even from mile to mile or every few miles vary the opportunity to get your crops in time or having to participate in prevent plant. So it's not consistent around Michigan. So for us, we were able to get our crops in and we appear to be doing okay. Our crops are looking good, but by far we're the exception. So as an individual who's out listening to others around the state, hearing what the challenges they are, having, it's significant. And those are issues we need to be having a conversation on.
There are 110 members of the House of Representatives. I rarely think of that as a place where you're going to find a bunch of folks involved in agriculture. Yet, on your committee today, we heard from West Michigan, Representative Merriman, who is a farmer, and others on your side, as well as Senator Victory, also from West Michigan on the Senate Agriculture Committee. It seemed that a lot of the folks on the committee are actually involved in agriculture, and that seems unusual.
Well, it's a very valid point. In individuals like Senator Victory and Representative Merriman do a great job of asking the question, a deeper level question, right, to the individuals that we're presenting today. But there are many on our committee that do not have an ag background. There were many from southeastern Michigan with no farm background whatsoever. And one of the senators afterwards came up to me and thanked me. She said the education that she received, the better understanding of our challenges with no agriculture background it puts her at a disadvantage when it comes to making decisions. To be a leader in the state, we need to have a variety of information, accurate information, timely information presented to us so we understand the challenges. When we look at Michigan, we know that agriculture is a $104.7 billion industry. We know that Michigan ranks number 2 in the most diversified states in commodities we raise and grow, especially on the west side of Michigan. You have an abundant number of different crops, commodities. So it's important that we reflect on all of the unique situations each of those commodities have. Nobody can be an expert, so today provided opportunities for everyone to gather information.
So when we talk about this hearing, you took it out to Michigan State University out in their big ag pavilion out there. And you brought together all kinds of different stakeholders, and we heard some remarkable stories, starting with the same issues that you dealt with, the wet, late planting season. But that's only the beginning.
Exactly.
Because whatever has been planted is all that's going to be planted, and it's going to produce whatever it produces whenever it does. But the yields will be lower. The harvest will hopefully be later, but if it's not, the yields will be even worse. And even at that, the commodities, the product that is produced is not going to have the same nutrition value. It's not going to have the same yield that it would in a normal year. And that sets up a long-term problem for farmers, doesn't it?
It does, and so that's one part of the conversation. The other is all the agribusinesses that are associated with it. I think in testimony today, what I found very humorous, the farmer that testified he wasn't able to get in the field and plant. Well, that meant he wasn't able to get in the field and his equipment didn't break down, which meant he wasn't going out to the dealers or for the repairs. It trickles down. The impact is significant as it plays out through all of our communities, but especially our rural communities that serve the agricultural industry.
And the problem is not just the trickle-down effect, because you made a very good point about just talking about the dairy industry. If milk production starts to slow down, and look, it's been a bad 5 years for dairy anyway, but if milk production slows down, there are all the things that dairy farmer doesn't need either, and that has the same kind of ripple effect. But the problem with production, particularly as it pertains to things you got to put in the ground, is that impacts next year's commodity and next year's and next year. I mean, being able to catch back up. And one of the folks who testified made the case, and I must admit to having a bit of a bias because I come from a farm background too, and it's always interesting because people will all of a sudden be startled when prices start changing at the retail level, because they don't necessarily pay attention to or even understand what the reduction in production of corn, for example, will be. And that can have an impact not just on corn products, but any animal that's fed with corn or any commodity that's made with corn. And that is going to be something that's going to happen.
It is. It's going to happen eventually. And then the processing piece, if that commodity isn't raised and grown, then what's going to happen to that second piece of the production line? It will impact so many of us. If the trucks aren't on the road moving the product, then who's buying that fuel and paying those fuel taxes? So it trickles out into so many areas that affect us all.
When you and the folks that were working on the process of getting some low interest loans available this year, that happened pretty quickly. You put that together. It got passed and signed in pretty short order. At this particular hearing, you heard from at least some of the folks involved in the financing part of it that it's a little difficult for farmers to know what their losses are going to be until they get later in the year. So we don't really know how impactful that's going to be. What do you hope the impact of those low interest loans will be?
I think it's just another tool. I don't think there's any one solution. I don't know how many farmers need that low interest loan, because as we heard today, the challenge is paying the principal, not so much the interest. I thought that was a valid point that was brought up today. It's just one more tool, one more option for a farmer to use to give them the stability they may need that may help them in these unstable times.
The big takeaway for me was I came prepared to listen to conversations about the weather. And you will never talk to a farmer that doesn't talk about the weather.
Yes.
So I assumed that we would hear that conversation. We did. And talking with the director of the Department of Agriculture afterwards, he and I talked a bit, and he said, well, the weather is the problem right now. That's part of the most immediate problem. But there are any number of pressures on the market. And one of the things we heard about was trade and how it impacts us, whether it's importing cherries or trying to be a reliable exporter of our commodities. How big a component is that?
I think it's significant. I do, because ultimately that economic piece is what sustains all of us. So that had to be a part of the conversation today as we looked at the services, USDA, Farm Service Agency, RMA, the crop insurance. Those are pieces, environmental components of not being able to plant the prevent plant and what that does to the environment, and then the weed production. Those are had to be part of the conversation at a federal level, but again, looking at the economic impact that trade plays on all of our commodities. You know, it's interesting because the unique piece there is each commodity is so different. To understand the challenges of the cherry industry, the dairy industry, definitely when it comes to trade, but each industry has different and unique sets of challenges there.
Well, I remember not so many years ago, then the Director of Agriculture at the federal level was Tom Vilsack, and he was visiting apple farmers, and they were trying to get Mexico to accept U.S. apples, but they, for whatever reason, couldn't get it done. So, I mean, each of these commodities, as you point out, is an individual standalone, and only California produces a larger variety of things than we do. So that makes it more complex, but it's also, as you pointed out earlier, a big part of our economy. So when you look at some of those trade issues, when you look at, you know, either how much we import or how much we try to export, how much on the state level can you and your committee and your fellow members do to impact that? Because that's very much a federal issue, largely.
And that's a great question. And I think what happened this spring is a perfect example of what we can do at the state level. When we knew that modifications needed to be made and USDA policy on planting the timelines, we as legislators, we had 63 legislators in the House come together and sign a letter to USDA Sonny Perdue, the director, to help him understand what challenges we're facing that are unique in Michigan. So we can continue to be a Michigan voice. We can act in a collaborative manner here as Michigan legislators and make sure that our representation and delegation in Washington, D.C. hear us. That is one of the, I think, the bigger pieces we can do. We can continue to be a voice. We're the boots on the ground. We as legislators are out there. We have office hours every week, right? We have staff that's there to meet and listen to our constituents that we're serving. So we hear, we understand, and we will continue to be a voice for all of Michigan farmers through our services and the USDA.
I want to pick up on something you said. You got 63 signatures out of 110. It only takes 56 to pass anything over in the House. How much do you believe, we talked about the makeup of your committee, how much do you believe those members understand the importance of agriculture? Because I always wonder, somebody said in the hearing that you had early in the week, the farmers make up, what, 2 or 3%? Of the voting population, or 2 or 3% of the population, period. And the other 97% of us just eat. So how many of your fellow lawmakers get it when it comes to agriculture?
I think it depends on what the conversation in agriculture is. If we are going to talk about the big picture of agriculture, 100% of them care because, again, it goes back to eating, right? And they want an affordable price, right? They want to be able to go to the grocery store and allow that to continue the price they're paying at the grocery store to meet their family budget. Ultimately, that's what it boils down to. I think one of the reasons I mentioned we had 63 out of the 110, that was because it was a time issue. We just wanted to get moving very quickly on it. But then I will follow up with education. Anytime we have the chance to educate legislators, to share with them exactly what's going on in our industry, they understand and they get it. They will buy in. But quite often, we with farming background, we chairing committees, need to stop and slow down and just educate all of our committee members so that everybody has the same information and can make an informed decision.
When we come back, more with the Agriculture Chairman of the House, Representative Julie Alexander. To the Point. Welcome back to The Point. This morning we're talking about all things agriculture with the Chairman of the Agriculture Committee in the State House, Representative Julie Alexander. When you think of this planting season, going a little bit back to that and dealing with legislators saying this is why we need to do this, is there also that component that we still don't know what that impact is going to be, and that maybe even later this fall or early next spring, you may have to come back to some of them and say, here's one more component that we may need to do?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the questions someone asked me earlier today is, what's the biggest challenge farmers are facing? And I instantly just said uncertainty. There's so many factors that are uncertain for farmers, and now to add to it, we don't know what our yields are going to look like. We don't know to what extent, and not just Michigan. We need to look at a bigger perspective. We need to look at the entire Midwest, because I went to a conference a couple of weeks ago in Madison, Wisconsin, visiting with ag chairs from all over the Midwest and country, actually, and listening to the challenges they have there. We know that we're in a global market now. We can't look at Michigan in what we grow and raise in isolation. We must be looking at a bigger picture. So we need to be reflective of that as well.
Yeah, a lot of these states have had similar problems, some perhaps because of the amount of crop they plant, and a lot of them are much more focused on a single crop, may have bigger problems than we do, but that still becomes our problem because it still has the same impact that we talked about.
It does. It impacts every rural community, right? So stop and think about if that farm, maybe it's a beef operation or a dairy operation, hog, whatever commodity they might be growing, grapes. Look at the trickle-down effect. If that farm leaves that community, how does that change the landscape of that community? Well, they're not paying into the tax base. How many of those farmers actually are serving on their township boards and school boards or whatever it might be, that involvement in the community? They're employers. They may only employ a handful of people, but those are families' livelihoods that depend on it, and the impact that trickles out to.
I want to talk about something that I don't think people talk about very much. Michigan State University Extension Office was there, and they talked about the work they do all over the state. But one of the components of that is something, and as I pointed out earlier, I came from a farm background, and I remember many mornings as a child with my father, we would stop at the local gas station, and that happened to be the place that had the round table and the coffee pot where all the farmers gathered, and they always talked about the challenges they faced. They always talked about the weather. They always talked about the market. But what they were really doing was kind of sharing that shared experience that kind of kept them all maybe a little bit more centered. But I was taken back by the conversation about the mental health and mental stress on agriculturalists and how the Extension Department at MSU has gotten very proactive in trying to address that, because that's something you rarely hear talked about when you talk about farmers.
You really hit on something that really hits hard for me, because we lived it. We sold the herd out. And to have my 83-year-old father-in-law look at my husband and myself, who made the decision to sell the milk herd after 40 years, and say to us, I really hoped I'd been gone before the cows were sold, right? It's the generation after generation. It's the legacy. This is when a farmer, especially dairy farmers, they are married to those cows, right? The commitment, the time commitment they put forth in them. And it is not only their occupation, it's their identity. And anymore what we see because the number of farmers is dwindling, they don't have that network. Sometimes it's even a little bit competitive when it comes to bidding out land, right? Who's going to rent the land? And it is somewhat competitive in certain areas of the state more than others. But the camaraderie, look at the number of divorces in farm families as well. I often say it's because the farm wives have to live, are working off the farm to bring in that income, to bring in that healthcare benefit, and the farm wives don't have a chance to commiserate, right? To sit and find that you feel as if you're isolated quite often. And I think that is one piece that is not helping our agriculture industry and maybe simply adding to the stress.
I think it's difficult for anybody that's not been involved in this process to understand. I'm just going to talk about dairy. We did that for a very short period of time in a very small scale. And you start talking about the bigger scale, that's twice a day, every day. It's holidays, it's Sunday, it's New Year's Day. Every day it has to happen. So that's part, when you talk about the commitment, and it's the same with row crop operations. You work when you can work. It doesn't make any difference what day it is. You don't take vacations, you do that. And so that's the kind of stress that in any job would build up. But I think farmers traditionally haven't necessarily had or taken advantage of those mental health services that Extension may be offering in some cases now. And that seems to me that's a pretty important component that they're offering.
The other thing they offer that impressed me is they do it in such a large scale all around the state that if a farmer says, listen, I need some help, I need someone to talk to, I need to walk through this with someone, you don't have to stay within your own community. The statistics show that the farmers that actually go for some sort of a service go at least 1 or 2 counties away because they don't even want anyone to know they're going for some help. So that's an important piece. Farmers are very proud, very, very proud, and that's a hard walk for many of them to admit and face. The other thing MSU Extension program called Farm Stress offers is that MSU is not going to the farms to talk to the people. They're going in the farm businesses and the farm industries. So they are going to those professionals who are having relationships and conversations with the farmers. So it's almost a train the trainer. They are looking for signs and symptoms, and then they are able to reach out and help farmers find that direction to go in.
My final question, and I didn't expect this to be it, but after sitting here and talking with you for 20 minutes or so, being a state representative, obviously, is an honor and something that you sought out and that you do. How important is it to you, as somebody who's lived it, as you just pointed out, to be chairman of the Agriculture Committee at a time when the state is taking a very critical look at what kind of a partner it can be for agriculturalists around the state? How important is that to you, in addition to being a member of the House of Representatives?
Well, I think the Lord knows best, and He's just tossed me down this pathway here. I've always said I want others to know and understand and be educated when it comes to the importance of our agricultural industry. And I think we were trained early. When my husband and I were first married, we were active with our co-op. We've been active with Farm Bureau, and those co-ops, organizations are bright enough to say we need to take our young farmers and we need to teach them and give them the confidence to tell our story, because I still to this day will offer this. If we as farmers aren't out there telling our story, who do we want to tell that story?
We'll be back with more To the Point. In just more than a week, the legislature will return, and it will be all about the budget. We'll have you covered when you join us every Sunday morning at 10 o'clock right here on Wood TV 8 for To the Point.